Hello, everyone, and welcome to Claris Community Live. I'm Rosemary Tietge, Community Manager for Claris, and I'm pleased to welcome our substitute producer, Tyler Furman, and Rick Kalman, one of the Claris platform evangelists. And today we're going to talk about the hidden risks of staying on older FileMaker versions. And as we get started, I think Tyler's just dropped in chat. Please join us in answering a couple of questions in our opening poll. We just are curious to know more about you as an audience, what versions of FileMaker you're running right now, and whether or not you're currently licensed for FileMaker 2024, even if you're still working with an older version, and why you're not yet running FileMaker 2024 if you're still on. So we'll let that run while Rick introduces himself and gives a kind of high-level intro to our topic today, and then I'll share back the results with all of you.
Thanks, Rosemary. So as Rosemary introduced me, I am Rick Kalman. I have been at Claris and/or FileMaker for, believe it or not, 25 years now, so a quarter of a century. I've had 3 roles in that entire time. I started out as tech liaison for the first 5 years, where I learned a tremendous amount about not only the product, but the community. Most of my career in product management. And then the role I'm in now is the platform evangelist, focusing primarily on the FileMaker platform, but obviously the larger Claris platform as well. So if you're not aware of this, I'm going to put this in chat because in the community there is a oops, and let me see. Let me get the link here.
Yeah, I can describe. So Community Insights is a new feature we launched in Community earlier this year. Think about it as a bit of a community blog, as opposed to like Claris's the .com blog that the marketing department produces. And we're using Community Insights to feature technical content and also profiles of community members. And so what Rick just is sharing is an article he wrote last month or the month before.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So, and the reason I wanted to point you to that link is in case you came to this webinar, but not through seeing that community insight, I would encourage you to go there because many of the resources that we'll be talking about today are embedded in that document, and there's some really good ones that will go much deeper than we can go in this hour. And on top of that, because some of what we want to talk to you today about how getting current prepares you for what's coming next. I did also put a link there to the YouTube of the Claris Engage keynote. If you were not at Claris Engage in Austin last March, then you can view the keynote, and then you'll get a lot of information about what's coming as well. So just to let you know. So, you know, one of the things that we're going to talk about, and we'll have a conversation, there'll be questions, and Rosemary and I will riff on each other, is starting out with some of the potential risks of not staying current. And you know, we know that it's not necessarily simple in the kinds of things you need to take into consideration when you're updating to the latest version of our product. And there's caution if you're experienced developers that you take, and there's other intervening variables like, you know, what your customers desire and that sort of thing. So we acknowledge this is not necessarily a straightforward, you know, just do it type thing. It's more of a conversation, but there's a number of things that you sort of become vulnerable to if you are running on older versions. A lot of times, you know, your customer will there'll be a new operating system, and they'll apply it, and an old version of FileMaker may no longer work on that operating system, and now all of a sudden it's an emergency, right? And then older versions may have security vulnerabilities that have been patched in newer versions. You could hacker could gain access to critical data through that because it's unpatched. That's another potential vulnerability. And then sometimes vendors will change what they support. For instance, some of the email clients that we used to support, those have been the mechanisms for supporting that have been closed off by the vendor because of security vulnerabilities. And so we sort of come along for the ride because we were taking advantage of those capabilities. New versions support OAuth email, but not some of the older protocols. So some functionality that you're relying on can all of a sudden, because of an update that's not even an operating system update necessarily, can also expose you. And then, of course, at some point, if the version is old enough, it no longer has official support from Claris. And on top of not having official support, we won't necessarily go back to older versions and apply fixes to them. Sometimes we do, but as a rule, we supported the last two more or less. Rosemary, any others that you can think of?
I mean, I think those are the highlights, and just to just share on our poll results, so that so to a large extent, people are running FileMaker 19, 2023, and 2024, and then handful. And all of those three versions are all 60, 40, 55%. And then older versions, there's a few percentages for each of those, and almost everybody, I think, yeah, about 87% of the people who've responded have licensing, even if they aren't currently deployed.
Say that last one again.
87% have a current license.
Mm-hmm.
For our license for FileMaker 2024. So they have a current maintenance contract or an annual license.
Yeah, so they have access to it. So you have the rights to it. You may or may not have deployed it yet, but you have the rights to it. Then one of my expectations would be, depending upon the kind of developer that you are, if you have a consultancy and a number of customers, or maybe you're an in-house developer, my expectation would be, especially for a lot of our FileMaker consultants, that they would have customers that are on various different versions. Now, maybe you're an SBA and you encourage your customers all to move to the version that you're supporting, and so that could be an exception. But if you have a dozen customers, half of them could be on older versions, because you may not be in complete control about when they move. There's budgetary considerations. There's if they have IT and they haven't agreed to move to the latest operating system or that sort of thing. So I imagine it's not 100% pure that you're either on an old version or you're on a new version, but there's probably a mix that you're supporting is what I would surmise.
Yeah, and then going to that, if you're not running FileMaker 2024, why not? Upgrading is hard, is the sense I'm getting from the word cloud. To a large extent, it's like people are saying time. You have third-party hosting. Looks like there's something people say 2024, and I'm not sure if what exactly. The word cloud sometimes is tricky, but yeah, it sounds like it's a hard process. And I'll just, and that's part of why we're here today, is to help, kind of talk through the benefits, the risks, and point you to resources that will help you get over the hump.
Yeah, and one of the things I'd like to point out, especially because we have a lot of people on FileMaker 19 or even previously, if you remember, FileMaker 19 lasted a long time. I was the product manager back then. It was essentially 3 full releases worth of enhancements, but we didn't change it from 19. Somewhere in the middle of there, I can't remember if it was 19.3 or 19.4. You may be aware of this, but you may not be aware of this. We made some significant enhancements to the ability to upgrade your server because we would pull along the settings that you had previously set versus having to upgrade the server and go back in and put in your schedules again and all of the variables that you had set up. So we made that radically simpler moving forward. Not everyone is aware of that, especially if they haven't adopted or they haven't moved on from 19 or even gotten to 19. So that's a heck of a lot easier as well. Just an FYI.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, like there's a comment here, someone said, one reason people don't upgrade is they feel like, I'm like trying to find, that there's a lack of real new features. So, I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, I did put that link into the article that I had put together. And one of the things I talked about, because remember, this is an article about if you're not on the latest version, which is FileMaker 2024, here is why we're advocating that. I list, I think, 5 or 6 enhancements that we did in 2024. The first being is really the first version where we've begun to integrate AI, large language models, and embeddings into the product. People say that, well, you could do this for quite some time with FMP URL or some of the other, curl and those kind of things. And yes, you could, but a heck of a lot harder, and you had to have a lot more knowledge about it. So what we're doing to the product with AI is making it more accessible to more people via scripts and functions that we're introducing. And so the first really big rollout of that was in the current version, which is FileMaker 2024. Also, we did a number of developer quality of life enhancements. For instance, we went back in, we had introduced Open Quickly, which is an easy way to get around to your layouts and your scripts and so on, and provided more control and capability there, quite enhancing that. So it's just a developer productivity enhancement. There's a number of things that we did with it, advancing our control of script steps, perform script on server with callback for people that are doing transactions, that we've continued to improve that. The execute FileMaker data API now supports write actions and validation overrides. So that's become more powerful. We've expanded our error logging to both WebDirect and API, so it's easier to troubleshoot. There is enhancements in performance and capability in JSON, which is something that's very powerful that we've introduced over the last couple of years and leveraged by AI as well. We introduced the ability to use Let's Encrypt certificates, and which really helps a lot with the people that are struggling with SSL, and making that a lot easier and automating that. And of course, we've also introduced along the way interactions and communication of the larger Claris platform. So that's being Claris Studio or Claris Connect into the broader platform. If you take FileMaker, sort of the foundation of the Claris platform, then we have Claris Connect for integrations, and we have Claris Studio that we're still building out for things like public-facing forms or external unnamed users that gets by the license without having to do custom web publishing or that sort of thing. So every release we do things along those lines. And of course, there is performance, security, and stability updates that we are constantly doing in the product. But it's just the nature of software. We're always going to try to improve it, add new capabilities. So that's what I would say about that. The document that I posted the link on, the community insight, articulates those and points you to either engineering blogs or the online help, and gives you additional information available on each of those features as well. So if you want to check that out.
Yep, I just want to share. A couple people said, someone said upgrading from 19 to 24 was a breeze. So just verifying that those improvements did help. And a question, and I don't know, Rick, if you can answer, or if we may need some of the experts that are in chat to answer. When you do an update in place, does your SSL configuration then carry forward?
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but someone online surely does.
Yes. Oh, someone says yes, it does.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And I think also, even if you need to kind of uninstall and reinstall, you can pull out the server certificate, and if you've already got a valid certificate and your server name and IP address haven't changed, you don't need to reapply, like reissue the server private key and reapply for an SSL certificate. You can simply re-import your old server's SSL certificate if you're doing an in-place update. And one last question from Dennis. When did Let's Encrypt become available for real and not just as a feature idea?
Well, for real was FileMaker Server 2024, and there will be some additional enhancements in the next major release that'll make it even more seamless and more integrated. And so I think but 2024 was when we first introduced it, gave a shell script to be able to do what you needed to do. Because remember, Let's Encrypt is, I think it's 90 days that you have to reissue it. And so that could be a pain if you had to go through what the normal steps of an SSL cert are. But Let's Encrypt is designed one. They don't charge you for it, right? And every 90 days you can update it. And you can automate that. And going forward, we're making it even easier in the next release through the admin console for server to configure all that stuff.
Yes. And yes, someone said the link to Rick's article took you to Claris Community. Yes, it is a blog, a community insight article in Claris Community. So if you're landing just on the community homepage and not getting to the article, if you use the menu, you can navigate to Community Insights under, let me just look. I believe it is under the Learn and Build
Yep, second to the last one.
Insights, and then I think it's the first article on that page.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So that is that. Yeah, and I think, just from the chat and from our poll results, thousands of partners and customers have successfully deployed FileMaker 2024, and even more are. And I think Abraham's question is a great transition to our next topic. He's still running FileMaker 19.6, and they want to move to the latest version, but fear there will be more issues because they don't have a FileMaker expert on their team. So Rick, do you want to talk a little bit about the recent updates, and then let's talk about how we can like help people think through a process to have a successful upgrade.
Yes. So if you were paying attention, you may have got notified or seen on the community that yesterday we did release an update to FileMaker Server 21.1.5. In that update that came out yesterday, we updated a number of our third-party systems like Tomcat and libcurl and so on. Some of them had security vulnerabilities that didn't impact FileMaker, but still come up to IT people in organizations getting flagged that there's a version of Tomcat, for instance, that has security vulnerabilities. So we went ahead and updated that as well. There was a bug that the theme catalog could get corrupted, and you wouldn't lose data, but you would lose the theme that was associated with that. So we have fixed that bug from occurring in the latest release, and that was something that it was had a lot of concern on the community about. So what we typically do is we begin to hear things after we launch a major release. Then as we hear about those things, that's when we do updates to try to address those. Not always can we address them all at once. So sometimes you may see multiple updates come out because while we're working on one that's a bit harder, we want to get out the stuff that we can replicate and we can get out there as soon as possible. But the thing is, remember, especially if you have a subscription, a volume license, an annual license to FileMaker, you're entitled to 3 servers, right? And one of the reasons, if you think about sort of the classic, DevOps process, is you have a testing server, and you then have a staging server, and then you have a production server. So my advice is when we come out with a new update, say FileMaker 2025 comes out, the best practice is always to test this first, right? So set up a test server, take your custom app or apps that you want to deploy, and then just run through it and just do a sanity check yourself. The thing I'm going to give you, an advice I'm going to give you, because I've run the external testing program, or ETS, for years and years. And while we are testing with the people in the community, one of the things you can't do because it's under NDA is to put it in production, right? So you can test, and my contention is when we put new enhancements in the product, people are atomically testing those to get a sense of the functionality and report bugs and that sort of thing. But it's really not until you deploy something in the real world that you actually put it through the different variables that it can be exposed to, multiple users, under load, different hardware configurations, weak machines, different cache settings, memory, all those kinds of variables can impact a deployment. So you first want to just do a sanity check, run through it. But then ideally, you're also testing it in a sandbox where you can have some people hitting it like the real use before it goes out there. But the other thing I'll say about when we every major release, what we're doing is we are trying to make our platform as stable, as performant, and as secure as possible, and then enhancements that will make it more and more capable, right? There are times where, for instance, you can do something that makes FileMaker more performant, and in that, what it does is unveils something underneath that you never ran into before because you couldn't get in that state. So I think it's the nature of software in that as you introduce things, as you try to improve the software, it could essentially mask unveil what was masked underneath because you could never get that in the situation. But now you've got 50 processes that you can run through versus a bottleneck, and all of a sudden the next thing revealed. So that's, I think, can always be there. It's always prudent, obviously, not just I would never advise you necessarily unless it was just not a very mission critical piece to deploy a new server without testing it first. I guess is the advice. Anything else, Rosemary, regarding that from your experience?
So I just shared an article I wrote last year about preparing to install your upgrade, and it really walks through step by step of preparing, letting your users know that this change is coming. So it starts with, as Rick said, if at all possible, install on a test server, load up your apps, and just make sure that they work. Do a smoke test, do a sanity check. And then also make sure your users are aware that this change is coming. Communicate to them, first of all, we're doing this change, we'll be more stable, performance may improve, all of those things. And then also start thinking about what, what other new features you might be able to adopt once you've done that update. Where can you do some performance tuning in your app? Or where can you add a new feature to make those users' lives easier? And Steve has called out a great question, but what about FileMaker Cloud? There, the end user has no control over when they get that upgrade. I mean, that's the contract you're adopting with Cloud.
One of the things, just so FYI, one of the things you are typically going to see is we will come out with a major release, say FileMaker 2024. FileMaker Cloud 2024 comes a month after that typically. And one of the reasons is we get out that release and we get the initial real world deployment in mass. And then we begin to receive feedback if there is a bug, for instance. And then we always try to address those early ones that we get before we deploy it to the cloud. So it lags behind there. So it's usually the more stable version that's benefited from the in-mass feedback we get that you can never get in an ETS. It's just not the real world in the ETS. Some of the stuff you'll be able to pick out for sure. But when you're in a multi-user environment, when you're in a more complex deployment, these things don't reveal themselves until then. So the cloud always lags behind for that very reason. Yes, but as Rosemary said, it's a service, right? And we're moving everyone forward at the same time, but also means that we have an obligation to make sure that the service we're providing meets your needs. So
yeah. I mean, and I think that's something that we as a cloud service provider at Claris, and also many of the partners who provide cloud hosting. You as a customer are saying, you guys are the experts about server. Provide this service to me, and I will then take those updates as they're deployed when you as the service provider are ready to deliver them.
Now, Rosemary had mentioned the links she had put in. I want to call out on a few of them. They are all in that that community insight blog that we've been mentioning. So I encourage you to go there. But in that blog, so we can spend an hour here, right? Even my blog is a summary of a much deeper topic, but embedded within that are some additional resources that are really worth diving into. One is preparing to upgrade to the latest version of FileMaker, and the other one is upgrading to the latest version. Very similar names. They go very much more into depth on the mechanics and the how-tos. The other thing that's really handy is there's a link in there to the FileMaker Pro version comparison tool. And essentially all that is a place you can go to, you click on that link and it'll tell you by version, I don't remember how far back it goes, when we introduce new capabilities. So you can easily go in there and say, when did they put in, AI? Because I want to take it. Oh, okay, that wasn't in until 2022. FileMaker 2024. So if I want to take advantage of that, that's the version I need. So it's a handy tool to just see, because there's so much that comes out over time, and it may not always be easy to understand when did that capability come in there. So I think that's another good tool to use, but I would really encourage people who are really interested in to know more than we're covering here to dive into those resources.
A couple of questions. So first, going back to FileMaker Cloud. With Cloud, you don't have a test server. So, how do you make sure as a customer that your app will be compatible?
That's a good question. And I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts, Rosemary? I mean, what's starting to occur to my mind is maybe that's a feature request of something that we need to provide a, there's a sandbox and you have a time to go forth because,
To test.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
I
yeah,
mean,
the
so
rules do change with cloud
yeah.
for sure.
So my thoughts in my experience as both a customer, a systems engineer, a developer, on the server side, it's very, very rare that a FileMaker app will be incompatible in some way with a newer version. Um, so from the server side, you're probably safe. And also, Claris, has a long history of always making sure features stay backward compatible. So it's very, very rare that, you install a new version of FileMaker Pro, for example, and something doesn't work. Because, I'm thinking, going way back into the dark ages, the transition from lookups to set field by calculation, for example. Lookups still work in FileMaker 2024. So I could take a FileMaker 3 file that used lookups and open it in FileMaker 2024, and it'll still work. It will not perform well because lookups are very slow, and I would be well served by making that coding change. But I think it's pretty rare that things actually break. And like one way to test is you can always download your app from FileMaker Cloud and just spin it up locally with FileMaker Pro. Like download the latest FileMaker Pro, get the trial in that testing window with FileMaker Cloud. Download the trial of FileMaker 2025, run your app, and see what happens. Yeah, so that's, so testing with cloud, yes, is a little bit more complicated. Also, is there a list of things that have been removed over the years?
Yeah, typically I don't I think there is a KB or a knowledge base article on the Claris site under resources. I think if you put in deprecations in there, you can get a list of things that are either deprecated, which means not that they're removed, but it's our early notice that we intend at some point not to continue to support that. Classic example is the runtime that used to be part of FileMaker Pro Advanced. We deprecated that for about 5 years until we finally removed it. So then that would be a list of something that was removed. Deprecation notices are you're just on notice that, so you have time to move away to something new. So I believe there's a KB article that will list all the deprecations.
Yep, I just dropped it. I just dropped the index article into the chat. And that then lists by version what was deprecated and what was removed.
We don't remove functionality that often. I mean, we take a lot of care to put stuff in. There are things that every once in a while we do. I mean, we obviously deprecated PHP, even though you could continue to use it with some resources from other folks, but it doesn't happen that often that we're actually removing functionality and capability.
Yeah, I mean, there's a call out that FileMaker 7 removed the today function. But I also remember that the conversion from FileMaker from FP5 to FP7 changed your today function to get current date. So it did replace it, but then as developers, we had to learn you can't use today.
Yep.
Yeah. So again, things will move forward. Yeah, question about classic theme. Older apps that have a classic theme is to blame when things don't work. I don't know if I'd take that take that exactly that way, but
I do believe, I think I remember that classic theme did have some performance impacts, and it's good to get away from those, and we've made it easier to do that. There's some enhancements to how you can control themes, I believe in FileMaker 2024 as well, making it a little bit more forgiving, if you were, easy to move there.
Yeah, and calling out the vanishing themes, as Rick said, that issue is now fixed. So we should be
Yeah.
safe there. And like the early reports from a few partners who've been testing extensively are good that the issue is now resolved.
Yeah, I saw Bev had posted another classic deprecation that it was instant web publishing, if you remember that, and then it was replaced with FileMaker WebDirect. In a lot of ways, a very different animal, if you will. You think about WebDirect in that you create something in FileMaker Pro and then deploy it to a web browser, and it's a rich web app, right? It is not instant web publishing was essentially a series of forms. Now you could get a lot of people doing there because it was stateless, right? So it's like you did something, you were in and out. Whereas WebDirect is going to keep that session going. So they're different animals, but radically more powerful than instant web publishing ever was. So another good example of deprecations.
Yeah, yeah, and another question about just how hard will it be to upgrade from FileMaker 17?
So
So
same file format, right? So that makes a big difference, right? And we haven't changed the file format in a while. People who are coming, because I still see people coming from even pre-10 stuff, it's amazing, or even pre-7. And then because we've had file format changes along the way, there's a way of working with support to get a version that will convert to the next one that'll then convert to the next. I would say that if you are coming from pre-7, trying to go all the way to 2024, then depending upon how complex the custom solution that you built is, there's a lot more to look out for. Anything within the same file format, for the most part, is going to very easily pull forward.
yeah, and I think, Rocky, what I would evaluate is, and I think Bev called this out too, if you're doing web publishing, that's going to be the biggest change and may require some refactoring of the especially custom web publishing setup, and that is a bigger lift. But if you are only hosting FileMaker to FileMaker Pro, FileMaker WebDirect, and FileMaker Go clients, and maybe are using ODBC connectivity, should be a very straightforward update. And again, because you're coming from so far away, I would not recommend an in-place upgrade. You'll probably need to upgrade your server hardware and server operating system anyway. So if you can, like, follow the best practice of, purchase your new server hardware, install FileMaker Server 2024, test, and if everything works well, then that just becomes your production server. You don't even need to then reinstall on another server. Yes, a question about a list of compatible Mac OS versions that run FileMaker Server. Yes, there's a knowledge base article of FileMaker Server that tells you every version and what operating systems were supported on that version. Give me a moment and I will find it and drop the link to it in chat. And while I do that, Rick, there's a question about sorting portals. I don't know if you can review and address that while I look for that.
Okay, so is this the one from Annette?
Yes.
Okay, on version 24, I had an issue when changing the settings of a portal, adding a filter or sort. The portal vanishes. I have to undo my last action to get the portal back and save layout and go into it again. Off the top of my head, I'm not aware, but I believe I have seen some things on the community around this area, but I don't have enough information off the top of my head to talk about it. There may be someone on the list that does, for sure.
Yeah, and my advice when, in this case, and also whenever you see anything weird behavior that's unexpected, is open a case with Claris support, either by calling the 800 number or by posting on the community in specifically the report a product issue topic.
Yeah, and it's important to do that through those mechanisms, because then what they do is they create a support ticket that then sets in motion, goes all the right places, to product management, to engineering, and to support who's tracking it. And so that is by far the best way. You can post stuff on the community, and a lot of times people can help you. But if there's an issue that you've uncovered, if you go that extra mile and report it through those paths that Rosemary said, that makes a big difference for us. As bugs get reported, the number one thing for us is if we can replicate it internally, then we most likely can fix it. So a lot of the most difficult thing for us to do is to replicate something you're reporting. And that's where the more information you can provide us about the operating systems and which version and what you're doing, if you have any, crash reports or logs, those are all very, very helpful. A lot of times the longest living bugs before we address them are ones that are the hardest for us to replicate. And again, I go back to, depending upon the environment you're in, the more complexity, the more variables there are between hardware and operating systems and versions and number of users, and if it's a highly transactional system, if it's got people are pounding on it, there's a number of variables that can be hard to replicate. A lot of times we may end up having an engineer interact with you directly to try to figure out, and we have a program called Ring Zero where we literally work with a person who's say, hey, the server's going down 3 times a week, it's going to drive me out of business, and then we'll work directly with an engineer. They'll give them special builds that they think address it, and then if we think it's fruitful, then we put it in ETS. So not everyone goes through that, but the stuff that, here's the thing is, we're trying to make server absolutely, utterly boring. You don't want an exciting server. You want a server that set it, forget it, it just does what it does. Obviously there's maintenance and that's those kinds of things with your schedules and your backups. But you just want server to do what it's designed to do, serve, right? And we get that in, all of my career here, I've strove to have a super boring server. Haven't succeeded yet, but hopefully getting closer.
Hopefully we'll get there someday. I think it's our long path. This is a good question. Is it better to upgrade the FileMaker Pro client versions before the server or after the server?
Good question. What is your experience with that, Rosemary? Does it? There's almost like warp and woof, or two sides of one coin, right?
Yeah, I think if you are in a situation where you're on a relatively recent version of FileMaker Server, you can push out the client updates at any time and then come back and update server. There's a hard line, and I think it's FileMaker 19.4.2, where newer versions of FileMaker Pro won't talk to versions of server before that. So there is some compatibility that you need to be aware of. But I think Faylene and Karsten both say keep in sync as much as possible. And Jessica says FileMaker 19. So FileMaker Pro 19 to FileMaker Pro 21. There you should be safe. As long as your server is running FileMaker Server 19.4 or later.
Yeah, and there are times where we do enhancements in the client that have dependencies on the server as well, having those enhancements, right? So they sort of come hand in hand, but it just depends upon what you're doing and using. The thing is, that the database engine, I believe that we use, that you are aware of, is Draco, right? Draco is everywhere. Right, so Draco is in FileMaker Pro, Draco is in FileMaker Server, it's in FileMaker Go, it's in FileMaker WebDirect, it's and so they're all share that same underlying database engine, which is the essence of what FileMaker is in how you experience, what its capabilities and its forgiveness when you do things like change field names and that sort of thing. And so we always try to keep those database engines the same all the way through the platform, because this is really designed to work together. So the optimal thing is to have the latest version of FileMaker on the latest version of Server, but there is capabilities of the mixing and matching. It's just that the further you go back, it may not even be possible.
Yep. Yeah, Robert is asking, so current FileMaker 16 deployment. Yes, so in your case, Robert, you can't update server because those FileMaker 16 clients will not be able to communicate with the server. So you'll need to plan a little bit. And my advice would be to pre-deploy. Like, you should be able to install FileMaker Pro 21 on all your client workstations, either over time, and just tell people don't use it yet because it won't work with the server. Or if you're going to stand up a test server, this is a great opportunity to say, okay, stand up your test server, seed a few clients, have them test, make sure everything works. But in this case, you will need to eventually deploy server and go live with clients all at the same time. So the upgrade article that I shared, the planning article that I shared, goes into a bit of detail about a few strategies to approach that.
I think that's a good sort of poster child for why we're encouraging you to try to stay with the latest releases that we have. I mean, I'll make the blanket statement that every major release we have is by far our most performant, secure, and stable version. That's what we tend to do. Obviously, there's bugs, and we address that through the VRES. But it's just that the longer you wait, the more burdensome it's going to be. For instance, this example of moving from 16 to 2024, there's more work to do there, right? So it's just that balance. If you start to fall super far behind, then it becomes quite the more burdensome. There are a lot of enhancements we've made over the years, pretty much because of the developer tools that we've released. Gone are the days where you have to say, okay, I'm bringing the system down on Friday. I'm going to pray that it's back up by Monday morning. And a lot of that had to do with just the sheer amount of data you would have to pull. And we've got fast data migration tool and other developer tools now that are being utilized by Auto and Automatic and a number of these providers that are doing their own hosting, not through our cloud, and those sort of things for the SBAs. And so it's less burdensome because there are more tools available over the years to pull that off. A lot of those are command line tools, so they're not essentially a no code way of doing it, but there's capability there.
Yeah, there are a couple of people have raised issues with my recommendation, and that is, so first, generally there is no issue with having two versions of FileMaker installed on your computer, as long as your operating supports both of those versions. So that's something else to keep in mind. If your Windows is a little more forgiving than Mac OS with those operating system version and client version matches. Again, I shared the server article. There is an equivalent FileMaker Pro article as well.
Yeah, and sometimes, like on the Mac, we have multiple versions. You have to be careful of, if your customer is just double clicking on the file to open it, it could open a version you don't intend. Yeah, I mean, there's little things like that, but because obviously at Claris, we're running multiple versions of FileMaker at the same time on our computers, and for the most part, not a problem.
Yes.
Hey, Rosemary, I would like to give a shout out for there are a number. I'm gonna put this in chat, and hopefully it. There are a number of resources that I want to call out as well that I think are key, because one of the things you may not realize is there has been a massive sort of up leveling of the kinds of resources that we're providing to folks from the Claris Academy that has a number of learning resources. A couple examples in there. There's a See What's New in the latest version of the latest Claris FileMaker 2024 release. There is self-paced training from Claris partners available. There are community lives like this that we record and you can come back to. Mark LaRochelle just did one on JSON if you wanted to know that. I mean, what better way than to hear about people that make their living off of FileMaker and off of Claris, talking about something that that we've intelligently at the level that especially more advanced developers want to hear. Those resources are there. There's more and more of those all the time. Of course, there's the community forum. And it's one of the best places to go to, if you're running into something, you'll find other people. It's a very giving community. One of the highest strengths. There's also a good article that came out a while, but still relevant, that Steve Blackwell and Wim DeCourt put together called Security Changes and Enhancements in FileMaker Pro 2024. That's worth looking at as they walk through all of the security things that are done, and they also advocate on why you want to stay up to date. So I encourage you, again, we're barely scratching the surface here, but there are a tremendous amount of resources out there already to educate yourself further.
Yeah, and I will dig this up. I can't look for it right now, but last fall I showed up on Richard Carlton's daily live stream, and we did we had a long conversation about the mechanics of getting through an upgrade process. So Richard taking it from the perspective of a consultant, a partner who's been in the business for a really long time, and who does a lot of work with customers using older versions. And me from the Claris perspective as a former customer, a systems engineer, a developer. So there's some good logistics. We talked a lot about, we got deep in the weeds of the logistics of managing a complex upgrade project. So I will make sure to share that when I share resources back to the community. And there's a question about a training version of FileMaker. So there's the free trial, which is good for 45 days. There's also the FileMaker developer subscription, which is for testing and learning. So that would be another option. So I think those are the two best options. And I did, as Tyler just said in the chat, I did just share I did just start the closing survey. Just want to hear what's your barrier. Like, I hope that maybe we've eased some of your worries about getting to FileMaker 2024. And also let us know if you'd like someone from Claris to contact you, either to connect you to a partner who can help you with an upgrade project, or to get current licensing. And there was one other licensing question, and Tyler, if you want to come off mute and answer that, because you are the sales expert, and Rick and I probably can talk about it, but we may not be right. And I think the question was, someone said he has a small number of people who access their FileMaker system, but they do it across many computers. So the question is, like, how many user licenses would they need to purchase?
Yeah, and so I think Steve asked that question. I had messaged him privately to answer,
Okay.
but I'll answer it here for everybody as well, just if anyone's curious. Our user license model is based on your number of users. So in Steve's example, he mentioned he had, I think, 3 users and 10 computers. So you'd only need to be paying per user rather than per machine. The caveat there is if you're running FileMaker Server, there is a 5-user license minimum. So you would have to purchase at least 5 licenses under today's licensing models.
Yeah.
Hey, Rosemary, before we run out of time, I wanted to give, if you go to the end of the blog on the community insights that I put together, one of the things we're saying is get to the most current version of our platform as a way to prepare you to what's coming next in FileMaker 2025. In that article, that blog, I did at the end drop a direct link to YouTube where we just posted the Claris Engage 2025 keynote from Austin, Texas. It's chapterized, so it's easy to consume. But if you weren't at Engage, where we did preview what's coming, and we're getting close. It's going to be in early summer. Our next major release is going to come out. Look at the things that we have done via that presentation, and then think about, for instance, as I said, in 2024 was really our first salvo into the AI LLM scripts and functions that we put in 2025. We continue down that path, more power, making it easier to do, and then you'll even see some future things that we're looking at. But if you want to take advantage of what's coming in the next major release, I would really encourage you at least to take a very close look at 2024 and what we did, especially with AI. There's also a number of what we call developer quality of life enhancements that we're trying to put into releases now, just to make your life easier. So you know, something that it's just frustrating. It's not hard to do, but it takes time. And things like the defaults that are, you always have to go in and change. We've worked directly with developers and got a great list. I think Fabrice was one of the champions of that. That allows us to just take we know you guys are in our product 40, 50, 60 hours a week, week after week, day after day, year after year. You know a heck of a lot more about living in our product than we do, right? Because you make your living at it. That's we do have that understanding, and you guys collectively have a massive expertise. That's why I think our community is so valuable. Is once or twice a year, this is our 40th year we're coming up on. Once or twice a year, I still hear about someone needing to convert Nutshell. Right now, Nutshell was like the 4 Wang engineers put that sucker together. That became FileMaker, and there are people still using it. It's amazing, right? Talk about a platform that is very forgiving.
Yes, we did celebrate the 40th birthday of FileMaker at Claris Engage. Well, I think we're about out of time. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Rick. Yes, there's a note about version numbers are very confusing. Yes, we've heard this before, and I will pass that on to our product naming team.
Yeah, and it may be a good time. You may have seen the announcement recently that Apple's going to change its naming convention for its operating systems, and it is also aligning, I believe, with the years. And the thing that's sort of kept us is we should align the version number with the year number so that we avoid that confusion. One of the things that's been preventing us is we're invariably going to get people said, what happened to the other 2 versions, right? But it may be worth getting over it, because once we make that pull the Band-Aid off, I think it would just be, it's even hard for us internally. It's like, okay, this is version 21, but we call it 2024, right? It's confusing.
Yeah.
Granted.
Yes, so thank you all. And I'll just want to just give an update for future community lives. We will have only one community live next month, and that will be 4 weeks from today on, I think it's June 26th. And my guest will be Eric Luce, and he's going to do a recap of his Claris Engage session about building web apps, modern web apps, back-ended with FileMaker. And he'll share some tools that he's built and made available to make that easier. So I hope to see you then, and I hope to see you before then in Claris community. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, Rick and Tyler.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.